ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਮੈਂ ਹਾਂ ਗੁਰਤੇਜ ਸਿੰਘ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ ਕੌਮੀ ਆਵਾਜ਼। ਦਰਸ਼ਕੋ, ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੋਹਨ ਦੱਤਾ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਿਊਜ਼ੀਲੈਂਡ ਤੋਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਨ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। ਪਿਛਲੇ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੌਮੀ ਆਵਾਜ਼ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਖਾਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ, ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਰਿਪੋਰਟ ਦਾ ਜ਼ਿਕਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਨਿਊਜ਼ੀਲੈਂਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਸੀ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਈਟ ਪੇਪਰ ਜਾਰੀ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ। ਉਸ ਵਾਈਟ ਪੇਪਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਚਿੰਤਾ ਜਤਾਈ ਗਈ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਨਿਊਜ਼ੀਲੈਂਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹਿੰਦੂਤਵਾ ਗਾ, ਜੋ ਭਾਰਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਾਂ ਇਸ ਵਕਤ ਪੂਰਾ ਫੈਲਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵੀ ਕੁਝ ਲੱਛਣ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਦਿਖਾਈ ਦੇ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। 2 ਪੇਜਾਂ ਦਾ ਵਾਈਟ ਪੇਪਰ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੋਹਨ ਦੱਤਾ ਜੀ ਨੇ ਜੋ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇੱਕ ਰਿਸਰਚ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ। ਸੋ ਅਸੀਂ ਅੱਜ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਦੱਤਾ ਜੀ ਤੋਂ ਸਮਝਣ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਕਾਰਨ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਕਰਕੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹਿੰਦੂਤਵਾ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰਾਈਜ ਆ ਉਹ ਵੱਧ ਰਿਹਾ ਗਾ, ਖਾਸ ਕਰ ਵੈਸਟਰਨ ਵਰਲਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਤੇ ਨਿਊਜ਼ੀਲੈਂਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਸੋ ਆਪਾਂ ਦੱਤਾ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੋਹਨ ਦੱਤਾ ਜੀ, ਕੌਮੀ ਆਵਾਜ਼ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਵੈਲਕਮ ਔਨ ਕੌਮੀ ਆਵਾਜ਼।
Thank you so much. Kia ora, namaskar. Thank you for having me.
How you define the Hindutva, first of all?
So, Hindutva is a nationalist political ideology. So, if you think about it as a system of political organizing, it started really in the 1920s, alongside the rise of fascism in other parts of the world. And as an ideological formation, then Hindutva ka goal yahi rehta hai ki Hindu rashtra banaya jaye. So how to build a Hindu nation that is based upon the idea of a single culture, a single people, and the production of a monolith. मतलब सब एक सा हो. और उसी के बीच में then that whole process relates to two things. One is the marginalization of those that are considered to be outside of the sphere of the nation. तो इसमें हम जो देखते हैं कि at the heart of Hindutva is the othering of Muslims, क्योंकि वो ideology में बोलते हैं कि Muslims बाहर से आए हुए हैं, the marginalizing of Christians. And at the same time, it's a process of incorporating diverse other religions like Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism under the monolithic framework of Hindutva. And the same process we also, of course, see in terms of the targeting of Dalits and Adivasi people, so that the goal is to incorporate them. और उससे जाके क्या होता है कि those that challenge or those that dissent this political ideology of Hindutva, they are framed as anti-Hindu, Hinduphobic, or even by that logic, because they see Hinduism, their version of Hinduism, as India. Anyone that challenges that the viewpoint then is anti-Indian.
All right. So, as you said, it's started in 1920 when not in India and all over the world, there were fascism, Mussolini, and after that Hitler. So, there's a novel that's called Anand Math. ये लेट 19th सेंचुरी में लिखा गया था। उसमें भी एक जो इस्लामोफोबिया के चिन्ह ऐसे मिलते हैं कि जिसमें एक इमेजिनेशन की जाती है कि हाँ, जहाँ पर एक जो इस्लाम का राज है वो बंगाल में, सो उसको एक इमेजिनरी हार दी जाती है इस नॉवल में। क्या आप समझते हैं कि इसमें भी कुछ लक्षण ऐसे थे जहाँ चिंगारी थी जिसने बाद में आके उसको बूस्ट किया इस ऐसी आइडियोलॉजी को? How would you define?
So at the crux of this is the idea of Bharat Mata, the mother India that is
Matram. Yeah.
That is superimposed on the national landscape, on the geography of India. So agar aap Hindutva ke maps dekho, so you will see on the map that it is the projection of the Hindu mother clad in saffron that takes over the whole of the landscape. So certainly you could argue that there are roots of that ideology in narratives, such as the narrative in Anand Math that you see. But I do want to point out something else, Gurteji, which is key, is that what Hindutva does is it takes those particular narratives and constructs them specifically into a political project. So for me, in that sense, I would think of the starting point of Hindutva as a political project in the works of Golwalkar, Savarkar, and the specific articulations that clearly articulate the notion of the formation of the Hindu nation,
आपने न्यूजीलैंड में ऐसे कौन से सिम्टम देखे, जहां हम पंजाबी में बोलते हैं कि लक्षण देखे, जिससे आपको लगा कि इधर भी ऐसी बात हो रही है, जो हिंदुत्व है वो इंडिया में तो फुल फ्लेज चल रहा है, तो अब इस वेस्टर्न वर्ल्ड में भी हो रहा है, जहां पर कोई स्पेस नहीं है ऐसी आइडियोलॉजी की, ऐसी सोच।
So, the first thing I want to mention is that what we see in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is also connected to what is happening, as you point out, in other democracies in other parts of the globe. So whether it is in Australia, whether it is in the United Kingdom, United States, or Canada. And so let me talk about the symptoms. So the first kinds of symptoms are where you see the growth in Islamophobic discourse that is connected to the Hindutva ideology. So, in fact, in my research at the center that I run, the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, or CARE, we had been working with communities at the margins who experience hate. So while doing this work, we started coming up with stories of people that were pointing to, particularly Muslims, Indian origin Muslims, that were talking about Islamophobia that is connected with Hindutva. So it was clear from their narratives that they were experiencing Islamophobia that is tied to the project of Hindutva. And a lot of what they were experiencing were connected to digital infrastructures or social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, where a lot of this Islamophobic narrative perpetuates. So I think, one of the most clear signs is in terms of the social media discourse and what you see happening on social media. And there you see a few things that are quite typical of the narrative of Hindutva. One is the continual production of the Muslim other. The second is the production of particular narratives that are the ways in which Hindutva produces the Muslim other. For instance, the narrative of the love jihad. So there are Muslims that are trying to kidnap or marry Hindu girls to convert them. Then there is the narrative of beef and cow theft. Then there is the narrative of Muslims reproducing in large numbers to take over the demographics of the population. So these particular narratives that are very much crafted by Hindutva ideologues within the context of India, ये तो New Zealand में भी दिखता है in terms of social media. So there are groups such as Hindus in New Zealand in which you will see a lot of Islamophobic content. And in fact, quite a bit of this content directly connects with the Hindutva IT cell.
Are you talking about group means a Facebook group?
Facebook group, yes.
Okay, all right.
Which connect to the Hindutva narratives in India.
Right.
Similarly, you see Twitter accounts. Now, with Twitter accounts, one of the most difficult things is to actually locate the geography of those. But to the extent that I could tell, there are Twitter accounts that are located in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that seem to be reproducing the hate that is produced by RSS and the BJP IT cell, the kind of Hindutva hate that you see being spread in India. So, I will give you one quick example to make this point. When we had the terrorist attack linked to ISIS on the Lynn Mall that just happened recently, one of the things that you saw is that on social media, on Twitter particularly, there were a lot of Islamophobic comments. So I did a quick analysis of the Islamophobic comments, and what was most striking to me was that almost 85% of the Islamophobic comments on Twitter in response to the Lynn Mall attack, at least the sample that I analyzed, were connected with Hindutva. So that to me tells me that there is a strong presence of Hindutva here. I also want to make another point, which is sort of the presence of organizations that are connected to the Hindutva ideology. So if you look at, for instance, the Hindu Council, that states in its constitution that it refers to itself as the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh. These are entities that one would argue are located within the broader infrastructure of Hindutva. Certainly, if you connect to the nature of these organizations, the VHP and the RSS in India.
So it could be some isolated events, means some isolated individuals, maybe who are commenting on Facebook pages, or so. Do you think it is organized everything, or it is just isolated?
That's a really good question. There are two parts to it. So if you look at these organizations that I'm talking about, they are organizational structures, right? So that's the first thing. And what I think needs to be looked at closely and examined is the extent to which these organizations, such as the Hindu Council or the HSS, reproduce the Hindutva narrative here. What are the linkages? What are the flows? How do the narratives, the ideology, the money go back and forth? I think there is quite a bit of research that suggests that we really need to look at the role of the Hindutva connected diaspora in supporting Hindutva in India. So it goes both ways. Hindutva ideology flowing from there into here, but also the role of the diaspora in supporting Hindutva forces in India, which is a vital question. The second thing is, coming to the question of the social media and the point about whether there is a pattern here or not. What I would argue is that there is indeed a pattern. So this is not just a one-off incident or a few people, but rather that there is what we would call in communication a discursive infrastructure, meaning एक पूरा basis है, foundation है, जिसके ऊपर ये ideology offer किया जाता है. Now, one of the things is that you might see a small set of accounts that are reproducing that ideology. But you also have to look at how is that spreading. जो हम social media में बोलते हैं कि कितने accounts उसको like कर रहे हैं, कितने accounts उसको share कर रहे हैं. So, clearly in response to the white paper that I wrote on cultural Hindutva and Islamophobia, the kind of targeting and attacks I have received, that in fact makes the point that I was trying to make in the white paper, that in fact these entities have a strong presence, which is why this narrative can so easily flow. नहीं तो आप देखिए एक चीज की अगर there are say organizations that do not really buy into the ideology of Hindutva, then they could come right out and say that, look, we are Hindus that support pluralism, that support diversity of ideas, and we reject Hindutva. Yeah,
that's very clear.
Yeah.
So we move ahead. That incident happened maybe a few months ago. 3 पंजाबी सिख लड़के थे, एक सरदार जी थे ज्यादा उम्र के, 50 से आगे, दलजीत सिंह, मनप्रीत सिंह और हरमनप्रीत सिंह, इफ आई एम नॉट रॉन्ग. उनके लिए ऐसे कमेंट होते हैं जो हिंदुत्वा का जो आईटी सेल है जो इंडिया में करता है, उनका जो नैरेटिव है वो वही है कि घर में घुस के मारेंगे. तो उसको आप कैसे डिफाइन करते हैं कि ये उसी धारा के लोग हैं?
Yes, thank you for bringing up this incident. And I think, one of the things, Guteji, that incident does for us is raise real concerns about the link between digital or social media hate and the actual expression of violence. I think that, to me, that needs to be looked at closely and not simply seen as a one-off incident. क्योंकि usually the dominant narrative क्या होता है, वो इसको देखता है कि इंटर कम्युनिटी क्लैश, कम्युनिटी के अंदर कोई क्लैश है, पर वैसे नैरेटिव में क्या होता है कि it actually misses out on the broader working of ideology. So you kind of pointed it out really powerfully, and I think that is something that needs close attention, that ये narrative of घर में घुस के मारेंगे, we will come and hurt you, we will come and find you, we will come and stop your voice.
Because ऐसे तो होता है ना, जो इंडिया में होता है, जो हम मुजफ्फरनगर की जो बात करते हैं, जो यूपी में बहुत मशहूर इंसिडेंट है, तो और भी बहुत जगह है जो मॉब लिंचिंग में एक नया वर्ड आया था कि मॉब लिंचिंग, न्यूज में काफी चला है, अब थोड़ा कम है, तो वैसी बात थी ये जो न्यूजीलैंड में भी इंसिडेंट हुआ. हाँ जी.
Right. So that is exactly the same strategy, at least the same kind of fear that is being produced through this kind of organizing, right? And I can tell you, Guteji, in terms of the kind of social media abuse I have faced, there are narratives such as ये इंडिया में होता तो इसको बर्न दिया जाता,
या मैंने हेराल्ड में भी पढ़ा था वो आपकी.
Yes, or we have to stop him at any cost. These are the kinds of narratives that are connected to real violence on the ground. So I think our policymakers need to pay close attention to the ways in which this works out. The other thing also is the ways in which the overarching ideology is one that reproduces Hindutva. तो ये farmers protest में जो farmers के साथ आके खड़े हुए, if they are Punjabis and Sikhs, we will frame them as Khalistanis. Now that is a narrative that is produced by the BJP IT cell, and that is produced by the Hindutvawadis, So when you actually just see that narrative being played out, whether it is in Australia or in New Zealand, you know that it is actually the Hindutva forces at work. क्योंकि ये जो डिसइंफॉर्मेशन है कि जो फार्मर्स के साथ जाके खड़े हुए, अगर ये पंजाबी है, so they must be Khalistanis, that's a narrative that is produced by the IT cell, So इसमें one of the things I think from a policy standpoint we have to really be mindful of is the ways in which the stories, ये जो lens है, कोई भी event के ऊपर जो lens लाया जाता है, to what extent that lens is interconnected. तो हम तो देखिए कम्युनिकेशन स्कॉलर हैं, मीडिया को स्टडी करते हैं, तो हमारे लिए ये बहुत क्लियर है कि जो हमारे रीजन में ऑस्ट्रेलिया या न्यूजीलैंड में जो लेंस बिठाया जा रहा है ऑन इवेंट्स, टू लुक एट इवेंट्स, that is actually reproducing the lens that is being generated by the hate industries of Hindutva.
बिल्कुल जी, ऐसे कुछ इवेंट ऑस्ट्रेलिया में भी हुए हैं जिन पर जो हिंदुत्वा के जो फॉलोअर्स हैं उन्होंने अटैक किया फार्मर्स पर, जो गैदरिंग थी उनकी, जो प्रोटेस्ट कर रहे थे इन सॉलिडारिटी विद फार्मर हु आर सिटिंग इन दिल्ली. ऐसा ही कुछ इवेंट कनाडा में भी हुए हैं. सो कनाडा में स्पेशली वो टारगेट जो हिंदुत्वा वाले वो करते रहते हैं जगमीत सिंह को, जो कि एनडीपी पार्टी के जो प्रेसिडेंट है. सो आगे चलते हैं प्रोफेसर साहब, जो वेस्टर्न कंट्रीज हैं क्या वो इनको ऐसे स्कॉट फ्री जाने देंगी? आप क्या सोचते हैं? क्योंकि बहुत से इकोनॉमिक रिलेशन हैं, अमेरिका के भी हैं, कनाडा के भी हैं, यूके भी हैं, ऑस्ट्रेलिया और इंडिया के भी हैं, ये अलाइज हैं सभी. तो क्या इनको स्कॉट फ्री जाने देंगी? अगर जाने देंगी तो जी बात बहुत आगे जा सकती है. सो आप इसे कैसे देखते हैं और एक्शन क्या, अगर आपकी नजर में कोई ऐसा एक्शन स्ट्रिक्ट जहाँ कोई पॉलिसी आई है जो इनको अच्छी तरह से जो हिंदुत्वा का जो पॉइजन स्प्रेड हो रहा है उसको काउंटर किया जा सके?
So you see, हम अपने रिसर्च के स्टैंड पॉइंट से बोलेंगे. I'll talk from we are researching. तो देखो हम केयर में we talk about listening to the voices of communities. तो पहली बात तो as a solution, Gurteji, I think that what we have to do is to build infrastructures or build spaces where we can hear the voices of minorities in the diaspora. तो हमारे काम में जैसे अभी दिखता है काफी that for instance Indian Muslims, they talk about how they have discussed these forces of Islamophobia in Hindutva. They have drawn attention to it. They have complained about it, but they feel that their voices have not been heard. ऐसे जब ये मुझ पे ये अटैक होने लगे तो there are quite a few people that got in touch with me and thanked me for doing this work, and then they brought up that there are many instances when we have shared this and our voices really haven't been heard. तो पहला सवाल तो ये है कि हम कैसे ये वॉइस इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर क्रिएट कर सके जहां पे वो diverse communities का voices can be heard and not just the dominant voices of Hindutva that seem to have the muscle to take over these spaces. दूसरी बात ये है कि for the government, I think, and for any policymaker is to pay close attention to the effect on the health and well-being of minorities in the diaspora. तो अगर इतना इस्लामोफोबिया है डिस्कोर्स में या एंटी सिख डिस्कोर्स है, इसका तो हेल्थ और वेलबींग पे भी इफेक्ट पड़ता है on the people that are experiencing the hate. So I think we have to really take that into account in terms of how that impacts people and how that impacts social cohesion and social fabrics, and the third point is in terms of the nature of our democracies everywhere. तो जैसे देखो हमारे न्यूजीलैंड में we have the Education Act that protects and guarantees academic freedom. पर मेरे ऊपर जो अटैक हो रहा है उससे आप ये देख रहे हो कि how many of these Hindutva forces have no idea of democracy or the basic democratic rights within the context of, say, New Zealand society. तो ऐसा you can see in various other societies, जैसे ऑस्ट्रेलिया में हो या कनाडा में हो या UK और US में हो. So I think for policymakers that is also another question, that in the context of immigration, in the context of migrant communities, how are you going to build pedagogies, ways of teaching of the habits of democracy? क्योंकि सवाल ये होना चाहिए कि आप जो अभी इंडिया में कर रहे हो, where you're depleting the democracy, where you're targeting the minorities, where you're lynching Muslims, or where you're carrying out this narrative of love jihad to attack couples in interfaith relationships, that cannot be acceptable in Western democracies. Right? So I think our policymakers need to make that absolutely clear. And then they also need to think about how they build the education. And intercultural education कैसे बताया जाए, build किया जाए जिससे हम वो democratic जो habits है वो सिखा सके लोगों को. तो एक चीज देखो गुरतेज जी, अभी आप देखे या नहीं पता नहीं मुझे, there was a recent piece of news on the Facebook whistleblower who pointed out that one of the largest hate factories is the RSS in India.
हाँ जी बीबी हॉगन है उसका नाम.
Yeah. And
मैंने शो भी किया था उस पे. हाँ जी.
Okay, great. And so one thing she points out there is that Facebook is very aware of it. They are aware of the research that this kind of hate content actually spreads hate, but also it is likely to go viral multifold, because hate का वही होता है कि उसमें virality रहता है. So it multiplies itself and it draws in audiences, which keeps the economy of these platforms alive. तो ये तो
उनको advertisement था.
Advertisement, और ये तो capital का logic है. So digital capitalism, in many ways it profits from hate, तो इसके at the heart of this is disinformation, कि सच को झूठ बता दिया. तो मेरे simple एक white paper which was all about cultural Hindutva, उसको बना दिया. And actually this is an Australian white yogini, Sarah Gates बोल के है, उसने ये चालू किया था कि उसने बता दिया कि प्रोफेसर दत्ता सब हिंदूज को अटैक कर रहे हैं, उसने बताया. दूसरी बात उसने बताया कि तो in that white paper I had taken the example of international Chinmaya mission and located it within the Hindutva ideology. तो उसने बता दिया कि प्रोफेसर दत्ता ने चिन्मया को टेररिस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन कहा. While the point is in the paper, what I had actually said is that Chinmaya is part of the Hindutva ideology. Swami Chinmayananda, who founded Chinmaya, also was one of the co-founders of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which is part of sort of a saffron terror network and has been seen as a terrorist organization. तो उसका उसने पूरा वो आर्ग्यूमेंट को तोड़ के मड़ोड़ के उसको बना दिया कि इज कॉलिंग चिन्मय मिशन अ टेररिस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन. तो वो दोनों पीसेस ऑफ मिस इन्फॉर्मेशन जो है फिर दे स्टार्टेड सर्कुलेटिंग थ्रू द हिंदुत्व डिजिटल नेटवर्क्स. तो लोगों का क्या होता है कि वो लोग तो व्हाइट पेपर पढ़ते भी नहीं है, उन्होंने बस ठान लिया कि प्रोफेसर दत्ता हिंदूफोबिक है क्योंकि ये न्यूजीलैंड के सब हिंदूज को टेररिस्ट्स बोल रहे हैं. So this is exactly how the disinformation spreads, right? That it sort of circulates itself without actually drawing attention to what the facts on the ground are. It is quite similar to अगर आपने कोविड के टाइम पे देखा होगा, you know, when the digital armies of RSS started spreading rumors that Muslims are
स्पेशली इन्होंने जो दिल्ली में जो तबलीगी जमात की जो मीटिंग हुई थी, उसको क्या नाम नहीं दिया मेरे पास, जो हम डेरोगेटरी नाम जो ज्यादा से ज्यादा दे सकते हैं वो हर कोई इन्होंने नाम उनके लिए यूज किया. तबलीगी जमात में की जो मीटिंग थी कि जय हैं, जे कोविड स्प्रेडर हैं, जे मारने वाले हैं, क्या जो भी दे सकते हैं सब उनको वही इस्लामोफोबिया से निकलता है.
एग्जैक्टली और इसके साथ साथ आप एक चीज देखो, जैसे वो गेट्स ने, वो ऑस्ट्रेलियन वाले स्टार्टेड टैगिंग एन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन कॉल्ड स्टॉप हिंदू हेट नेटवर्क. और अगर आप जाके वो उसके वेबसाइट पे देखो स्टॉप हिंदू हेट नेटवर्क के, they reproduce those kinds of Islamophobic and anti-Christian narratives. और उसमें जाके they use as examples speeches from Tejaswi Surya. Who is Tejaswi Surya, if you ask? This is a BJP politician who actually has been accused of giving hate speeches. You know,
okay.
So all these networks are connected. So coming back to your question, what can people do? They have to be critical. आपको जब ऐसे कोई इंफॉर्मेशन जैसे व्हाट्सएप पे आ गया कि मुस्लिम्स थूक रहे हैं खाने पे, इस तरह से इंटेंशनली कोविड फैला रहे हैं, you should question it. If something seems absurd or too extreme to be true, then in all likelihood it is too extreme to be true. So you should really question the information that is being given to you. तो इसको हम बोलते हैं कि क्रिटिकल लिटरेसी, कि आपको अगर कोई इंफॉर्मेशन मिले, नॉट ओनली जस्ट टू बी एबल टू रीड इट बट एक्चुअली लुक एट कि उसके पीछे उसका एजेंडा क्या है, उसका एक्यूरेसी कितना है, उसका क्वालिटी क्या है. वो पहली बात है. दूसरी बात यह है कि इफ यू फील दैट कि आपको कोई इंफॉर्मेशन ऐसा मिल गया एंड दैट इज मेकिंग यू इमोशनली एक्साइटेड, राइट, सो देन you should take a break from it. You should move away from it, take some time and then process it. क्योंकि hate जो है it circulates on the basis of affect. हम जिसको बोलते हैं कि इमोशन के जरिए पे वो सर्कुलेट होता है, क्योंकि हमें जैसे मिल गया हम वैसे फॉरवर्ड कर दिए. As an example, so when you disconnect and dissociate yourself, you give yourself the time to process and engage it. तीसरी बात ये है, देखो, for those of us in the diaspora, जैसे एवटेरोआ में देखो हम ये बोलते हैं कि न्यूजीलैंड में वी आर अ सेटलर कॉलोनी. यहाँ पे माओरी के स्ट्रगल्स है, इंडिजिनस पीपल के स्ट्रगल्स है. तो पहली बात तो ये है कि वी शुड ट्राई टू लर्न द हिस्ट्री ऑफ द प्लेस दैट वी आर इन एंड कनेक्ट टू द स्ट्रगल्स ऑफ द पीपल देयर. तो मुझे कभी कभी ये बहुत अजीब लगता है, जैसे हम माइग्रेंट्स आ जाते हैं, बोल देते हैं कि वो रेसिज्म है, and we try to play the victim, but without actually learning about the real histories of colonization and the struggles of indigenous people. तो मैं तो पहले ये बोलूंगा कि जैसे न्यूजीलैंड कॉन्टेक्स्ट में you try to learn Tetiriti or Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi that was signed between Maori and the Crown. You try to learn about the principles of Kaupapa Maori, जिसमें बोलते हैं कि हम सबको एक साथ मिलके चल सकते हैं, आरोहा लेके, with love. तो उससे क्या होता है कि you start challenging also some of the existing beliefs you come with, which brings me to my next point कि हम काफी टाइम में क्या करते हैं, as immigrants we bring in our ideologies of the past with us and try to recreate the spaces that we come into based upon that ideology. तो ये हिंदुत्व वालों का यही एजेंडा रहता है कि they want to recreate these spaces based upon that ideology of hate. So this onus, I think, is on us as migrants to actually learn about the principles of democracy within the context that we are migrating into, you know. So finally, I will wrap up, G, with one point, which is the role of policymakers. कि policymakers के लिए भी मैं ये सोचता हूँ कि जैसा देखो हमारे इंडियंस के लिए आपने एक दिवाली फेस्टिवल कर दिया, या आपने एक चाइनीज के लिए लैंटर्न फेस्टिवल कर दिया, एंड उसको आपने मल्टीकल्चरलिज्म बोल दिया. But that approach to multiculturalism is actually very shallow, क्योंकि for the rest of the year, you're not really creating opportunities for people to actually learn, move outside of their cocoons and connect with the broader communities. So if you're truly committed to building multicultural spaces, you have to create avenues for learning and dialogue among migrant communities, with Maori, Pacifica communities of color, so that there is a broader understanding and education created, you know.
दत्ता जी, मेरा लास्ट क्वेश्चन है, इसमें दो क्वेश्चन एक्चुअली. एज मैंने न्यूज़ में पढ़ा था कि आपने अभी रिसर्च अपनी जो शुरू की है, आपने पहला वाइट पेपर जारी किया है, आप आगे भी इस पे कुछ काम कर रहे हैं, तो आप काम कैसे करेंगे? जी, तो पहला सवाल है. दूसरा सवाल इससे कनेक्टेड ही है कि जब आपको इतनी थ्रेट्स आ रहे हैं, जैसे कि इसको जला देते अगर ये इंडिया में होते, वो तो वो सही बोल रहे हैं, क्योंकि जो ऑस्ट्रेलियन प्रीस्ट था एक, वो भी उन्होंने जला दिया था, जो क्रिश्चियन प्रीस्ट था. तो ऐसी सिचुएशन में आप क्या अपनी स्टडी जो कंटिन्यू रख पाएंगे? क्या ऐसा जो माहौल आपको मिल रहा है? अच्छा, एकेडमिक्स ने तो सपोर्ट की है वर्ल्ड वाइड, तो जो टोटल यूनिवर्सिटी है, जहाँ जो आपका जो सराउंडिंग है, वो आपको कैसे सपोर्ट कर रहा है?
So first of all, आपने जो बोला कि academics का पूरा worldwide support आया है, and it's from the leading academics in this area. दूसरी बात ये है कि हमारा जो यूनिवर्सिटी है, Massy University, that has given me full support. Massy ने कहा है कि the Education Act protects academic freedom. बस वही नहीं, हमारे academics का न्यूजीलैंड में एक रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी होता है, हम जो बोलते हैं टू बी द क्रिटिक एंड कॉन्शियंस ऑफ सोसाइटी. तो जो पावर है उस पे सवाल करना, ये एकेडमिक्स का काम है. तो उस तरह से मैं अपना काम कर रहा हूँ. तो मैसी यही बोलते हैं कि प्रोफेसर दत्ता को तो अपना काम करना है. मैसी ने ये भी कहा है कि कोई भी पॉलिटिकल प्रेशर यूनिवर्सिटी पे आए, हम उसको चैलेंज करेंगे, क्योंकि ये हमारा एकेडमिक फ्रीडम के अंदर ही आता है. और फ्रीडम मतलब ये नहीं कि उसके साथ रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी नहीं है, पर फ्रीडम मतलब ये कि हम पावर को चैलेंज कर सकें. ये जो कंसोलिडेशन ऑफ फोर्सेस है, जो ये डिसेंट को दबाना चाहता है, जो आपने that you keep seeing in India, right, that they are putting academics in jail, or they are finding various ways to bully academics. तब जाके मुझे लगता है गुरतेज सिंह जी कि for us academics in the West, it becomes our responsibility to speak up and to actually talk about what is going on, because our colleagues in India are facing so much more violence. जैसे वो dismantling global Hindutva conference जब organize किया जा रहा था, उसकी जो Indian organizers थे, they were getting death threats, the women were getting rape threats. So within that context, I think we have to take our responsibility seriously. So मैं कैसे ये how will I continue my work? I think first is that I have the support of the university, and more importantly, I have the support of New Zealand democracy. हाँ, ये तो नरेंद्र मोदी का इंडिया नहीं है कि आप जो चाहे करो, एकेडमिक्स के ऊपर जो चाहे ऑपरेशन करो और वो वॉइस को साइलेंस करो. दूसरी बात ये है कि I have been amazed at the kind of support I have received from communities. From community organizations like the Indian Minorities Association, the Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians, the Bhagat Singh Charitable Trust. ऐसे काफी संस्था है, the Hindus for Human Rights, जो मुझे आके support किए. उसके साथ साथ I have heard now from many Muslims, Sikhs, who have people in the community who have said, Professor Datta, you need to do the work because our voices need to be heard. तो वो मुझे बहुत सुकून मिलता है कि ये काम तो चलो करना चाहिए क्योंकि इसका कोई वैल्यू है. तो फाइनली मैं यही बोलना चाहता हूँ, देखो कि there are sort of the New Zealand police is sort of working on this. We have NetSafe, which has already identified the kind of bullying that is happening. So they have identified that that Australian Twitter account, for instance, of Sarah Gates is bullying me, and they have issued statements in those regards. And I think those give us important tools to engage with our policymakers. So one next level pe, I think the question for me is to engage actually policymakers. This is a question not just for me, but for any academic that is trying to do critical work, is that आप कैसे यूनिवर्सिटी तो सपोर्ट कर रहा है, पर आपका क्या रोल है as policymakers to support the university and to address this kind of bullying. मुझे एक चीज बस बोलना है कि जैसे आप देखो अपना courage रखे हो and you are speaking up, उसी तरह से I'm trying to take inspiration from you and speak up. And I think that if more of us speak up and speak out, and if there are more voices like us, we will actually change this.
Yes.